The problem is that people take literature as history and have an inability to distinguish between a work of literature, which the Gospels represent for the most part, and an actual history, which is what Josephus would give them, a nitty-gritty, down-the-earth, ugly, nuts and bolts history. So if you try to take the difference, in the Gospels you have the presentation of a miraculous figure who does miraculous things, for instance, who takes evil spirits, throws them in the swine run off the hillside and drown themselves, or walks on the water, or multiplies loaves and fishes, or turns water into wine. People love those episodes. Those are the dearest episodes in people's culture. There's no reason that they shouldn't, but that's not history. That is literature, or the dirty word, mythology. Those things, to the practical computer-linked-up network person of the 20th century, never happened. That is part of the beautiful presentation of the most beautiful being in the world. Now, the history can be something rougher and more down to earth. I don't know the history of Jesus, because it's been so overwritten with that sort of material. But the thrust of that sort of material is primarily, unfortunately, anti-Semitic, because all people understand Jesus except Jews, and Jews gnash their teeth at him. So the Jews are pictured in that literature as the blue meanies. And that has successfully engendered a wave of anti-Semitism in every generation up to the present, ending in the Holocaust. The seeds are in the picture. The people who put the seeds in were very clever. They were not Palestinian Jews, obviously. They were not self-hating Jews. They were overseas Gentiles who didn't like what the Jewish people represented and didn't like the doctrines about Christ. So that whole picture, to my mind, is, I hate to use the word, people hate me for it, corrupted. That's where the scrolls come into play. The scrolls are an indigenous literature of the Messianic movement from a Palestinian viewpoint, which are not corrupted. They were not worked on by an editorial committee. They were put in the caves to save them, and they're like a time capsule. They remain for 20 centuries. That's why I'm so interested in these scrolls. So, what do I think Jesus was? Everything written in the scrolls. That is the kind, whether it's mentioned there or not, that is what the Messianic movement is: a nationalist, extremist, xenophobic, and very much law-oriented apocalyptic group. What do we get in the scripture we're familiar with for overseas? Very good proselytation documents, but largely in the interest of the Pax Romanum, and often the very reverse of everything we have in the Dead Sea Scrolls. So yes, to my mind, Jesus has been reversed, turned in the very opposite of what he would have represented in Palestine as the Messianic popular leader there. Meaning he would not have been sitting with prostitutes and sinners and tax collectors. He would have observed purity regulations to be a popular Messiah. He would have been anti-Roman. He would not have been talking to Roman governors and Roman soldiers. Roman soldiers would not have recognized him as the Messiah before Jews did. These are all documents aimed at proselytizing Roman soldiery and Roman governors, not Jewish people, and presenting Jews as the devil people. And the world has got the picture. Even bin Laden's got that picture.
Now, is that why James has been marginalized?
Absolutely. Because as James was written out, he's a Philo-Semite, anti-Semitism was written in. That's exactly what happened. And there's a second James in the scripture. That's the multiplication of like-named characters. He's called James, the brother of, not Jesus, John, the son of Zebedee. John and James, the two sons of thunder, James, the brother of John. But that James, the brother of John, is conveniently eliminated from the book of Acts just when the real James is introduced into the book of Acts. And the interesting thing about him is that Paul doesn't even know him. Paul, a contemporary writer who knows all these people, Peter, James, and some of the others, never mentions James, the brother of John. So even in those problems, these multiplication goes on, and there may be the multiplications can be explained by the marginalization and the pushing James aside because of the sort of messianism he represented was not cosmopolitan enough to do the job that those people were intending to do. Paul says, "I believe in winning. I run the race to win." He says this in 1 Corinthians 6. All the runners at the race are fighting for a prize. I run for a prize that will never wither. That's how I fight, not beating the air. So he uses Roman stadium athletics to show the kind of way he approaches. I'm a Greek to the Greek, a Jew to the Jew, a lawkeeper to the lawkeeper, a lawbreaker to the lawbreaker. I will do whatever I have to do to win. And he wins. And these Jerusalem people don't have a chance against that kind of person. He is the first Lombardi. Winning isn't the only thing, it's everything. Or Al Davis, just win, baby. Paul is the first win baby of the beginning of the millennia. And he does win. But we would consider that a rather cynical approach to proselytization.
Now, I spoke yesterday to one of the, what's his name, the professor from Edinburgh? Balcom. And he said, I played a little devil's advocate with him and did a little Eisnman with him. He says, you can't, on the evidence, James, Peter, Paul, they all got along like a house on fire. Yeah, they differed a little bit about, they didn't agree, the issue was not, of course, James thought that Jews shouldn't start breaking the law. That wasn't an issue. Wasn't an issue for Paul. They really, what was the relationship going to be between Gentiles and Jews? So they all got together. Everybody's making a big deal about factionalism. I don't see any factionalism, he says. Basically, they got along. They had little issues about how does the Gentile movement and the Jewish movement, sit at the same table. That's all. Eisnman and the rest of them are saying conflict, where there are no conflicts.
There's total conflict. All you have to do is look at Galatians, where Peter and Paul and the others are in this special place called Antioch, where Christians were first called Christians. By the way, I don't think it's a normative Antioch. I think it's this place in northern Syria, Syriac Antioch. There were 5 Antiochs. This is Edessa in northern Syria. I'm sure that's where it was. That's where things were going on. They were all called Antioch. But the point is, then the messengers of James came down with his instructions to oversee communities. And Paul himself admits that all of the people who used to keep table fellowship with Gentiles stopped doing it and withdrew because of the party of the circumcision. They call James's party the party of the circumcision, and the messengers from James. Even Peter did this, and he said, and I accused him to his face and said, Peter, you are a hypocrite. And in any case, after that, Barnabas leaves Paul, and everyone shuns him from that moment on, and he will only travel with non-Jewish Gentile traveling companions like Timothy and others of that kind, Lucas, etc. So you tell me that's a minor dispute? That's a major dispute when all of his close companions desert him and refuse to have anything to do with him. Now, if you look in Essene practice, the Essenes have a characteristic of shunning. They expel people from the community for various things, and then they shun him in work and activity. This is exactly what's going on here with Paul and the others in the Antioch scene, and it's clear that we're having quasi-Essene practice going on here of a very familiar kind. So these arguments are very deep. I would say one last thing about that. Paul constantly cavils against the chief apostles. He constantly says, who are these people? Pillars? Not that their importance means anything to me. He says things like men of knowledge. Are they men of knowledge? Then he makes some nasty comments and says they're not even able to tell the difference that an idol is nothing. They make trouble over eating food sacrificed to idols, one of the strictures of James's rulings. An idol is nothing in the world, he says. And then at the end of Corinthians 2, he said, Hebrews are they? So am I. Super apostles are they? So am I. And he makes clear that the people who he's heaping abuse on are the super Jewish apostles who are over him, and he's constantly caviling and making snide allusions to them that anyone in his right mind, except someone who wants to just make everything look rosy, would realize had to do with severe internal strife. The final thing he says in Galatians, he's talking to his communities and the super apostles coming and bothering them. What they're bothering them about is circumcision. And he says in one nasty outbreak, tell those who are bothering you, I wish they would themselves cut off. meaning I wish they would themselves, their own sexual parts cut off, making it look as if circumcision is cutting off your sexual parts, but also parroting the fact that Essenes expelled outsiders by cutting them off. So he does a double entendre there in the real ferocious antagonism he feels to these so-called Jamesian Jewish Christians who are insisting on circumcision.
So the fighting, the infighting was real.
Severe. I think there is evidence that Paul is involved in some manner in the death of John the Baptist. Now, I don't want to make that sensationalist, but you can look at the trail and see that he was on a mission over to this king who was Herod the Tetrarch, and Herod the Tetrarch was arguing with...
Just let's not go...
Yeah, no, it doesn't matter. Doesn't matter.
What do you think James and Paul felt for each other?
James didn't hate anybody. He wasn't that kind of person. He was the righteous one. He was a totally righteous person. Paul had envy for James. He had antagonism to James, and he literally probably wanted to destroy James. And when he was arrested in the 60s by the Roman governors and held in protective custody, even when Ossuary had taken an oath to kill Paul because of introducing Gentiles in the temple, what happens in Caesarea in Acts, which is now an historical part in Acts, not an overwritten, looks more like a debriefing session. And it's funny, no members of his community come down to visit him at all. And he's being housed in Agrippa I's palace there. And ultimately, they get him out of the country on a appeal to Caesar. But to have stayed in the country would have meant his death. There were so many people who wanted to kill him for what he. But they didn't want to kill James. James wasn't being hunted down or anything. James went on functioning as if nothing was happening while Paul was under arrest. Yes, I think that was very severe, even unto death. I think ultimately, this is way beyond where I would like to be. Paul, with his discussions with the Roman authorities, would have given information that led to the final demise of people like James.
Paul was a collaborator?
Paul could not have gone to Rome and then been freed in Rome, and the way he went, without entering Roman service of some kind, and he held a Roman citizenship. So he went to Rome in 62, the time just when James was killed in Jerusalem. You know, the book of Acts ends not with James's death, where it should end, the leader of the whole. It ends with Paul under loose house arrest in Rome, and it doesn't look like he's going to be executed then, because he's not executed for another 8 years, and the stories are that he goes on to Spain and elsewhere. I even think he came back to Palestine. In the meantime, there's a character Josephus described called Saul, who's a member of the Herodian family, who also makes an appeal to Caesar, and very definitely is in the service of the Roman authorities. So I don't say he's a collaborator. He's someone whose allegiances are worrisome.
Where does the tradition that he goes to Spain?
It's he mentions in one of his letters that he wants to go to Spain, and then some of the extra-biblical material talks about his having gone to Spain. So if he went to Spain, and if he returned to Palestine, which I have a reason to believe he did, before he died around 68 in the midst of the uprising. The Romans have just rounded up all troublemakers by that time and executed everybody, and the dragnet would have included people like Paul by that point. But if he returned to Palestine, then he had to have entered service in some way, like Josephus did. Josephus went to Rome. When he came back, he was in Roman service. That's how he saved his skin. You cannot go to Rome and come back. You can't go to Stalinist Russia and come back. Free, I mean. You end up in the gulag.
Was there an ideological reason for them to want to schlep to Spain?
Well, I think the Roman emperors at that period came from Spain. Don't forget, you had Trajan coming in, you had Hadrian coming in, you had a lot of connections to Spain in the Roman imperial family at this time. He said he has very important contacts there he wants to follow up. And the future Roman emperors all came from Spain.